Hello, how you guys doing? Let's do this. In the beginning of the chapter on building suspense, Benjamin Percy brings up that lots of writers are scared or even offended at the idea of outlining a story or fiddling with it in any type of way outside of the very writerly exploring and discovering, not planning what happens, so on and so forth, which he points out is why we have loads of listless stories where nothing happens, and then the excuse is that it is a reflection of modern life. And anyways, that's really boring. Please include events in your stories unless you're genuinely a master and you can make a story about growing grass interesting. He also gets into talking about how an important part of generating suspense is to make sure that bad things happen, and that the exercise he suggests is figuring out for your characters what the worst case scenario is that could happen. I think that's very funny and fun to do, and I think that this is something that's going to play into some of the ideas I wanted to share with you. Something that I think is of the utmost importance is demonstrating to the audience that there are very real emotional stakes, and that this might be a story in which things take a turn for the worse and don't resolve in a warm or victorious fashion. The reason for this is that if the audience knows that though there are those stakes, then there will be genuine relief if things do end up resolving in the character's benefit, because we actually thought that things might go badly, because there was a very real chance that the bad guy could win, that the good guys could die, or that the person didn't end up with the one that they loved, so on and so forth. I'm going to mention a good man is hard to find. One of the reasons that this story is so memorable is that it is a story where the main character and her family are met with a major conflict. They bump into a rampant killer and his crew, and the main character and her family are not able to worm their way out of the conflict. They are all murdered by the killer and his crew. That seems like it's probably an oversimplification, and that story is way good for a lot of other reasons, but it is important that there were very real emotional stakes, and Flannery O'Connor makes good on some of those threats. The people end up dying. They're murdered because things just didn't turn out for them. Your audience will know if you're calculating an acceptable number of losses in order to try and convince them that you mean business. A bad example from a book series that I truly love is from Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. To me personally, this feels like J.K. Rowling is trying to meet a quota for how many deaths she needs to put in order for the audience to take her seriously. I was able to mostly guess who would die later in the book based on if they had a standout scene or standout character beats earlier in the novel, so as to make their deaths feel more significant. Readers can detect that kind of thing. And I'm sure that the writing violence section talks more about this, but a lot of death is sudden and unceremonious, and people don't even have time to debrief how to deal with that. Emotional stakes are not all about death. That's just an example. It's easy to talk about death because it's dramatic and a concrete thing. Let's talk about some bad examples, and let's talk about some good examples. Bad example, The End of Breaking Dawn by Stephanie Meyer is an incredible example of not being willing to go where a story needs to go. Two clans are about to fight because they have reached an impasse to which they find no other recourse but to fight to the death. That sounds not boring. Sounds like a showdown, what it kind of ought to be. And then one character has the ability to see into the future and is able to explain their way through the entire fight, and then the fight doesn't happen, and also Jacob is in love with Bella's baby. Gross. While it would be fun to wail on the Twilight series for a variety of problems, I'll try to focus on what is relevant here. Stephanie Meyer seems terrified of conflict. That doesn't make very good fiction. A more controversial hot take is from The Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Conflicts arise, and then they are immediately resolved. This is something that Benjamin Percy warns against in episodic narratives, that if it feels like a conflict arises, and then the conflict is resolved, and then a conflict arises, and then a conflict is resolved, and that they're all separate, the reader kind of wonders what the point of that is, and also it's just boring to read. Conflict should never be immediately resolved, because if a conflict is immediately resolved, you don't have any time for it to really register and have any sort of impact. Here comes my cat. Your story should be so integral. Every piece of your story should feel so integral that it should feel as if the middle of your story is removed, then your story would be crippled. let's consider some good examples of building tension in literature and movies. One that I'd like to use is The Giver by Lois Lowry. First off, it's much better than you remember, and the book opens and we're introduced to Jonas, who is a pretty normal seeming 12-year-old boy. We're introduced to his family, and in the second chapter, Lois Lowry goes out of her way to make his parents seem really understanding and nice. They're debriefing with their kids about their feelings, which is what basically all modern parenting manuals say to do. Jonas is worried about what job he'll be put into at a big ceremony that happens when all the kids turn 12 in this world. So what is the worst case scenario here? That would be what Benjamin Percy would ask Lois Lowry while she's writing. And the book goes out of its way to go through all the potential jobs that he could get and basically lets us know that none of them are bad. It is merely the anticipation of getting selected that is bugging him. It's scary to think of a future that he doesn't know about. So what could go wrong? The answer is he gets selected for the weirdest job ever that he didn't know existed, and now he knows even less about his future than he did before. Good move, Lowry. But it gets a lot better. Jonas starts to learn from The Giver of the title that parts of life that he didn't know existed. The reader, start to learn that the world of the novel is not what it first appeared to be. The author parcels out information at such a pace that we are fascinated by what is going on with Jonas and his world. The information does not make Jonas's life easier either. That a new conflict arises from the resolution of the previous conflict, is what I mean to say. Things get crazier and crazier. He now knows things about life that no one else but the Giver understands. We learn that no one can see color except for the two of them. We learn that no one can feel love but the two of them. The novel opened with Jonas's super cool parents talking to them about their feelings. Later in the book, we realize that they don't feel the same things that Jonas is able to. And worse, that Jonas's really sweet dad that plays with kids all day in the nursery also euthanizes babies that are deemed too difficult to deal with. Jonas finds out that Gabriel, the child that they are tending to, is going to be killed. And so he makes a decision that completely rocks his world. He takes the child and rides away on a bike. Every single conflict that arises and is resolved in The Giver leads to another conflict. This is kind of what Benjamin Percy is talking about in his point about juggling multiple flaming chainsaws. I think I have some criticisms of that section, but regardless, that section has to do with the idea that there should be multiple conflicts going on, and I would say that I would add that there should be the end of conflicts should lead to other conflicts. That's how life is as well. There's never a point where we finish something and we're like, all right, well now everything's okay. I wanted to talk about setup a little bit. It's important to set up a status quo so that when conflict comes in and interrupts that status quo, we notice that there is a change. If we start in the middle of change, it's harder to create a sense of disturbance, I guess, and we want to create a sense of disturbance so that we can see that the character is struggling. We as the audience should be struggling with them. A lot of stories start in media res, which means already in the middle of the action, but the audience is able to pick up what's going on from context clues, and that's good, but we need to remember with those stories that we still need to be taken to a more interesting place than when we started. So if you start us out in a burning building, you're giving yourself a challenge here, because we need to go from a burning building to something that's more interesting than being inside of a burning building, I would argue. I will just use one last positive example. The novel Carrie by Stephen King is truly an American classic, and it pretty much does everything right about sustaining tension. It lets us know that it definitely has high emotional stakes, and then later we learn that it has really high physical stakes. We're following Carrie in the present, and then we're also getting flashes from the future because there are books that have been written about some incident that happens with Carrie, and we know that people are going to die, and so it's not a question of if people are going to get hurt, it's when and how. And that is enough to sustain the promise that there will be blood, right? I can't recommend that novel enough. It was it's the best book that I've read this year. Keep some of these points in mind, and sorry that I was so scrambled while you're trying to write suspense and creating suspense for your novels and short stories.